Let go!
After a very long break, two icons of 1970s television finally reunited for some quality slow-motion running. And to mentor several new bionic people.
I can't do that.
I can't either.
Steve Austin and Jaime Sommers are back in 3 TV movies, starting with The Return of the $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman.
You don't need an appointment.
You could just rip the doors right off the hinges.
In this video, we look at 3 television movies that brought back the stars of the 70s classics, The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman.
Hey, if you're gonna start something, you better be prepared to finish it.
3 action-adventure movies wrapped around Steve Austin and Jaime Sommers finally getting together. And there were 3 movies that pushed the envelope of long television movie titles that almost didn't fit on the envelope.
You know, you're not taking this very seriously.
I do take this very seriously.
For those who skipped our videos on The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman series, a very quick recap. The $6 Million Man started off as a television movie starring Lee Majors that was originally based on Martin Caidin's book, Cyborg. It was followed by some more TV movies, and finally a weekly series that became a huge 70s success. Astronaut Steve Austin has a terrible accident and is saved with pioneering surgery by Dr. Rudy Wells. Steve will receive bionic legs, a bionic arm, and a bionic eye. He could run really fast, had quite an arm on him, and his trick eye could see further than a normal human, who, in the normal course of events, would need a bike if they wanted to get a closer look at something in the distance. Steve goes on missions for Oscar Goldman at the OSI, missions that had national security implications, but in practice saw Steve going undercover as a lumberjack, a magician, or a dock worker. The show's unique selling proposition was Steve's slow-motion battles that would be replicated by kids whacking each other and going taka taka taka, ow, my eye. In the show's second season, Steve met up with old flame Jaime Sommers and they got engaged. And as you do, they went skydiving. However, Jaime was horribly injured and near death, saved only by Rudy Wells performing bionic surgery, which gave her 2 legs, an arm, and a bionic ear. Jaime's bionics caused her distress, leading to her death.
Our friendship is finished, that's true.
But the character was so popular that ABC insisted that she be brought back, and pretty soon, guest star Lindsay Wagner was being showered with money to head her own weekly series, The Bionic Woman, created by Kenneth Johnson. To keep the 2 shows separate apart from the odd crossover, Jaime had a memory block about her relationship with Steve, where if she remembered, the pain might kill her. So after that, they were just bionic besties who'd occasionally show up in each other's shows. The Bionic Woman series saw adventures that became more tailored to Lindsay Wagner's strengths, where she would go on to win an Emmy for her performance. Both Bionic series ended in 1978, and the stars would go on to other projects such as television movies and weekly shows like The Fall Guy. But to a generation of fans, Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner would always be bionic.
I know you're still in love with Jamie. Still waiting for her to come back to you, the old Jamie.
Then in the mid-80s, Richard Anderson and Lee Majors were on vacation together and improv'd scenes of their characters, Oscar and Steve. This gave them the idea for a reunion project, and Anderson pitched the idea of a TV movie and a potential pilot series to Universal, who then sold the idea to NBC. Michael Sloan was brought in to write and produce, and while he'd worked on a lot of action-adventure series, he had never been involved with either of the original Bionic shows. And truth be told, it really does show.
She said things to me I don't even understand.
In The Return of the $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman, first screened on NBC in May of 1987, there's a lot of scene setting to be done for people who'd never seen either show, and for those who hadn't watched in over a decade.
That sounds good to me.
Steve Austin has retired from government work and runs a charter boat.
Summer maiden. Any particular summer you had in mind when you named her?
His old boss, Oscar Goldman, still runs the OSI, and Jaime Sommers works as a therapist at a rehabilitation center. An apparent chance encounter engineered by Oscar sees Steve and Jaime bump into each other, but time has not healed old wounds.
She remembered everything.
Steve's previously unmentioned and estranged son, Michael Austin, is a reckless Air Force lieutenant about to graduate, and the pair have a brief meeting that doesn't go so well.
Because then maybe you can find some time for a son.
A few days later, things go even less well when Michael's solo flight ends in disaster. Steve again pleads with Oscar to authorize Dr. Rudy Wells to perform life-saving bionic surgery.
We owe you a lot, pal.
Meanwhile, a previously unmentioned organization of fanatics called Fortress, led by Lyle Stenning, want the secret of bionics, so they try to kidnap Steve. Then they try to kidnap Jaime. Then they do kidnap Steve's son and Rudy Wells. There's just lots of kidnapping, all the kidnapping. Michael is much like his father was, unhappy at being turned into a Lego Technics man, but he uses his newfound powers to help his father and Jamie save the day. Michael also has nuclear-powered limbs and can run much faster than Steve or Jamie, and as a kappa, he finally does get a frickin' laser beam eye. Laser beam eyes are jolly useful, just so long as you remember to take off your sunglasses first. The guest cast includes Martin Landau and Gary Lockwood, who's playing a different character to the ones he played in the series, and in a small role as a doctor, Bryan Cranston.
I can't tell you why.
Which I'm sure is something that will never, ever be brought up in interviews to embarrass him. Also in a very small role is Catherine McGowan, wife of Patrick McGowan, who gets a TV-friendly version of the question asked by many pervs.
I wonder what parts are bionic.
Tom Schanley was Michael Austin, the bionic son of the Bionic Man, a man barely alive and a man who will be banned in perpetuity from Sunglass Hut.
Jim Castilian. That's with 2 L's.
One face who would appear in all 3 of these TV movies was Lee Majors II, who played OSI operative Jim Castilian.
It's Castilian with 2 L's.
Oh, you can have the 2 L's if you like. Rudy Wells would also resolve an issue that every smartass had been bringing up ever since the $6 Million Man first debuted.
I replaced 10 ribs with Vitalium substitutes, like in your body.
He throws in an explanation about why Steve's spine does not fold like a nervous poker player.
I reinforced his spine with Serosium.
The movie brought back Steve and Jamie, Oscar and Rudy Wells, and attempted to fill in what had happened in the decade since the shows had ended.
You're blaming yourself for what went wrong in Budapest.
Parts of it work really well and seem in keeping with established continuity.
Didn't I give enough? 2 legs, an arm, and an eye.
And other parts feel like the writers were sent the wrong videotapes, almost like they thought they were rebooting a 60s spy series like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. or Mission Impossible.
And then I want you to think about being bionic.
If I were being charitable, I would suggest the writers watched the final episode of The Bionic Woman as a reference and assumed that covered both series.
It's not your fault.
There are mentions of the bionic dog Max and the death of Jamie's boyfriend Chris Williams, as well as a little about Steve's original accident. But then there are lots of inventions to cover the intervening years.
There was a big explosion at the American embassy, and I was hurt. Oscar had to get me shipped out of there, and
OSI here is now shown as a full spy organization. Steve and Jamie's post-series adventures come off like the sort of discounted spy novel that you bought at an airport before a very long flight and then left it behind half read in the seat pocket when you arrived.
There are only 4 bionic human beings in this world.
The later movies will talk about various bionic people in the world and ignore 2 of them introduced in the $6 Million Man series. And in possibly the worst gaffe, Jamie, who only ever had a bionic ear, suddenly has a bionic eye in the 3rd movie. In one of the movies, Oscar talks about his years in the field with Steve, though if you've ever actually watched The $6 Million Man, Oscar talking about fieldwork with Steve is stretching the truth somewhat.
I didn't spend 30 years behind an OSI desk pushing pencils or shoving pins into third world hotspots. I was out on the field.
Return of The $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman was screened by NBC in May of 1987 and was a rating success. Its near $5 million budget was almost 10 times what an episode of The $6 Million Man cost in the mid-70s, and for the most part, the production values were solid for a television movie at the time. Noted composer Marvin Hamlish, of all people, provided a mainly electronic score that was as 80s as a 1986 Airwolf calendar.
You're the $6 Million Man.
Probably 24 by now.
Though despite the success, a spin-off series following Michael Austin's adventures was not ordered.
I wouldn't want you to think you're the only $6 million man around.
When you watch this first TV movie, you will notice an increase in production value, bigger stunts, but a hell of a lot more dialogue. It tries to meld 70s plastic cheese with slightly more mature 80s cheese, and it is a mix that's not entirely successful.
I made a promise to Oscar.
Of course, it just might be enjoyable enough just to see Steve and Jamie together again.
You've got to start having confidence in yourself.
A second movie was ordered and eventually screened in April of 1989. Bionic Showdown had a smaller budget of just under $4 million and was filmed in Toronto, though part of the movie was actually set in Toronto, which is why it's not so strange that everybody looks so cold.
It's gonna snow.
Bionic Showdown was another reunion that's mixed with a pilot for a potential series about Kate Mason, a young woman who'd been in a wheelchair for most of her life. She's given bionic surgery that will finally allow her to walk. And she's played by Sandra Bullock, which is never not going to be weird. But you know, everyone's got to start somewhere. I mean, I started off reviewing late-night infomercials. Then I progressed to reviewing television commercials. And then I moved to reviewing James Bond films.
Rolex.
Amigo.
When you put it like that, doesn't seem like I've progressed very far.
And all the circuits have to be monitored by a computer.
Oscar is being sidelined at OSI by General McAllister, and Steve Austin has apparently decided to propose to Jamie at a fancy banquet, when events get in the way thanks to a security breach. There are some off-brand Olympic-style games taking place in Toronto. There's Kate's friend Jim Goldman, who's a wannabe stand-up comedian, and someone who happens to call Oscar Goldman Unky Oski. Jim's set to compete at the Unity Games, but he also has a thing for Kate, except now she's being schmoozed by the slick OSI agent Alan Devlin. A bomb destroys Steve's boat and seemingly seriously injures Jim, and when Oscar's pleas to General McAllister to allow Rudy to operate on Jim are ignored, Oscar makes a loud, noisy and messy exit from OSI. He's very loud and he's very noisy, but we mean metaphorically messy. Not that Oscar left a smelly DNA sample on McAllister's desk. Something is up at the OSI. Evidence points to a traitor with apparent bionic abilities, which leads to Steve and Jamie being under suspicion, which of course is not made any better by them escaping. Oscar's now being feted by other spies, upset that the end of the Cold War means that they'll be out of business. Oh, sweet summer child. It turns out that Jim was not injured, and Oscar's apparent defection was all a ploy to ensnare the real villains, a CIA traitor and an OSI operative, Alan Devlin, who turns out not only to be a traitor, but also another bionic man. At the Unity Games, Kate has to prevent Alan from setting off a bomb to kill the Russian foreign minister. Steve and Jamie rescue Oscar, and in the end, they finally get engaged.
Wouldn't you like to get married?
Again, Bionic Showdown was treated as a pilot for a new series, one that would have featured Kate and, had it been picked up, would presumably have continued with a pre-superstar Sandra Bullock starring, along with Jeff Yagher.
Try and deal with it!
Robert Lansing and Geraint Wynn Davies guest starred, and it's a solid cast for this sort of thing, though you do miss the fact that Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner don't play as big a role towards the end. The scenes of Oscar pretending to have gone off the rails are cringeworthy.
No, I don't want to go. There's nowhere to go, Steve. There's nowhere to hide.
Though they're made slightly more palatable by the fact that it's all an act. But again, it had music by Bill Conti and probably ended up with the best music of all three films. It's more 80s than a boutique that only sold red leather jackets.
It's our dream come true. Your prodigal children back in action.
It would be 5 years before a third and final movie was put together. Bionic Ever After, and yes, the question mark was in the title, so we have to say it as Bionic Ever After, despite how annoying it sounds when said out loud.
You're kidding.
That's the way it works.
The working title was Bionic Breakdown without a question mark. But instead it's called Bionic Ever After.
I understand.
Bionic Ever After starts in the last few days before the wedding of Steve Austin to Jaime Sommers. Jamie had been treating an OSI agent, Kimberly, when she starts having difficulties with her bionics. Meanwhile, in the Bahamas, the American embassy has been taken over by terrorists, and they've erected a Scud missile with a nuclear warhead which they threaten to launch. Jamie's failing bionics put her in hospital, and a pre-recorded message,
I have to call off the marriage,
drives Steve into asking for a mission from Oscar to keep his mind off Jamie's health problems. Steve heads to Nassau to deal with the embassy, helped by OSI agent Kimberly. Rudy diagnoses the cause of Jamie's problem as a computer virus that targets bionics, which does suggest Rudy's previously never mentioned before partner, Dr. Haviland. The solution to Jamie's problem boils down to basically turning the bionics off and on.
I made some improvements I think you'll like.
A recovered Jamie and Oscar visit Haviland's widow, only to discover that their daughter was Kimberly. Da, da, da!
It's not every day you get to work with a living legend.
In the Bahamas, Kimberly has implanted the same computer virus in Steve, which knocks out his bionics just as he's gotten into the embassy.
Is that your plan?
Well, it used to work.
Jamie rescues him and the pair have to stop Kimberly's boyfriend from launching the rocket. But afterwards, it's time for Steve and Jamie to finally get hitched.
Way to go, pal.
This third film was made for a similar budget as the second, though it was filmed in Charleston, South Carolina. Unlike the previous two movies, this was not treated as a pilot for a new series and kept the focus on Steve and Jamie. So there are no new bionic characters, and there are also fewer bionic gags until the very end, where Steve bionics are restored just long enough to bring down the villain, Miles Kendrick. You know he's a villain because A, he has a foreign accent, B, his name is Miles, and C, he has long hair. Owen is that piddly bit about the shooting his own men, but Miles, yuck! Kendrick was played by Geordie Johnson. Farrah Forke was his girlfriend Kimberly, who was somebody who wanted to avenge her father and then decides not to be that vengeful at the very end. And Lockhart also appeared in a small role. For For the most part, this third film was an opportunity for Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner to give their characters an uplifting send-off.
Antiques. I resemble that remark.
It was getting to the point where Steve was right.
You know, we're definitely getting too old for this.
As a note to other middle-aged actors, slow-motion action scenes are not your friend. Bionic Ever After was screened on CBS in November of 1994, bringing to a close the Bionic era.
Jamie may never be bionic again.
There, of course, would be a very short-lived Bionic Woman series in the 2000s, and a movie that's just never ever coming, but we won't talk about those just yet. However, for the three movies we are talking about, only a few people involved with the original shows returned, and that is mainly on the cast side. So there's no involvement from people like Harve Bennett or Kenneth Johnson. Each of these three movies have bits that work really well, and bits that don't work so well.
Well, I wouldn't recommend it.
The action is fun enough and well staged, and thankfully they used some of the Bionic sound effects. There's a lot of commonality running between these three. There's an OSI traitor in every one. There are lots of people smashing through windows, as in if there's a pane of glass large enough for a human body to crash through it, then it follows a human body will crash through it.
Would you mind leaving through the door? Our window's closed today.
And once every window has been introduced to the concepts of mass momentum and bionic retribution, they start on the doors. The newer Bionic characters tended to have more visual effects added to their Bionic scenes.
I see I've broken a few of your ribs, Oscar.
Though Steve and Jamie still ran and jumped in slow motion, which, to give its scientific term, is known as the person in front of you at the bank depositing $250,000 in coins. But there is another commonality for these three movies: dodgy writing.
I can't find the words, but they're hard.
Michael Sloan was a writer and producer on several 70s and 80s series, where he wrote a cracking episode of Columbo, Now You See Him, wrote for Battlestar Galactica, and co-created The Equalizer. But he also had a sideline in producing television movie reunions that could potentially serve as pilots for new shows. He'd already produced The Return of the Man from U.N.C.L.E. and would later produce TV reboots and reunions for McCloud, Kung Fu, and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. For the Bionic television movies, Sloan would produce, and with other writers, write the scripts for all three movies.
Well, the famous Steve Austin.
And while I've never really had a problem with his writing elsewhere, the scripts of these three movies really do let things down.
It's just the most awful thing I've ever experienced.
The plots are fun enough, though they don't really fit in with either of the original shows, and in places the dialogue is cringeworthy.
You're not gonna go bionic on me, are you?
While the 70s shows were cheesy, they both did right by their lead characters, and rarely had them talk for the sake of talking. The writing was economical, with characters rarely going off into tangents or starting very long speeches.
Jimmy, I don't have the time for you. I just don't have the time for you, but I'll make the time.
In the old shows, they still managed to convey the emotion and intent of the scene, just with fewer words, particularly for Lee Majors. Here, Lee Majors in these three television movies possibly has more dialogue than he did throughout the entire 5-season run of this $6 Million Man.
I know what's going on in that devilish mind of yours. Once he's back in the fold, once he feels the adrenaline flowing through those bionic veins.
Here, this bantering bionic bunch feels like a group of chatty Cathys speed dating with verbose Vinces.
We were surrounded in that chateau, and Stenning was throwing grenades at us?
Richard Anderson ends up with some particularly laboured dialogue in the first movie, though in the second film at least, he does get a few scenes allowing him to do some proper acting.
For the first time, I am going to ask for something personal.
Funnily enough, Lindsay Wagner and Martin E. Brooks don't end up with reams of soap opera dialogue. Or just maybe they had a better handle on how to pitch this.
Let me tell you about them. They're robots!
The guest stars generally do well. We have Martin Landau, Sandra Bullock, Robert Lansing, etc. But the casting in smaller roles can be very hit and miss, much like William Tell after too much apple cider.
I'm sure you can explain it to us.
Also, mullets. There are a few mullets, and even Steve sports a semi-mullet. Now, he was a guy who kept asking for the 70s version of short back and sides, even when everyone else was growing thick sideburns and beards.
Very impressive.
The mullets are as late 1980s as a Prince album masquerading as a movie soundtrack.
But that's exactly what we want.
It's hard to pick the best of these three TV movies, since they're all so variable. The first has to try and reintroduce the characters for newbies and yet fill in blanks for the old fans, and does it with about as much subtlety as calling the SWAT team on yourself when you've locked yourself out of your house.
Now look what you made me do.
The second probably holds up the best despite some ridiculous plotting, while the third dials down the action, yet never loses the three-cheese ravioli feel.
We want every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a tin badge and a cowboy ego from here to Timbuktu out there when we leave.
There's also an incredible inconsistency about when to stick to established continuity and when to ignore it. I mean, it's from scene to scene.
I'm bad ready.
So I've noticed that the best way to enjoy these three films after rewatching either or both Bionic series is to leave a really, really long gap before starting the TV movies.
I can't believe that.
On balance, I'd go with the second being the most enjoyable. All three are enjoyable for fans, even if it's just to see the old gang back in action again. Just don't think about it too much, which is the same advice that I give my accountant every year.
Not bad, eh?
The budgets were healthy for this sort of thing, with action scenes that were far beyond the scope of the original shows. Yet it still seems like a little TV-ish, thanks to the bar for action scenes having been raised so dramatically since the end of those weekly shows.
When was that?
Well, it probably started when we carved our initials on that tree 10 years ago.
Lindsay Wagner is just Lindsay Wagner, pure class, and she always just got it.
Sometimes old-fashioned's the way to go.
You've been telling me that for 20 years.
Lee Majors is always great, but he has been given way too much dialogue. Martin E. Brooks had a knack of knowing how to deliver scientific lines believably, and Richard Anderson, who by this stage was also a producer on some of these, seems to have defined Oscar's look as a multi-millionaire about to marry his third wife, a teenage Hooters waitress named Mitzi, with a Y.
There's nothing you can do now.
The main guest stars were fine, though of course Sandra Bullock would show why she would become a superstar. She's probably very lucky that her film wasn't picked up as a series. But I suppose if it had, she'd have made it very fun to watch.
Jaime Sommers and Steve Austin.
I do.
But with that, Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner were done playing bionic characters on television, which means if you wanted to recreate your childhood and injure your friends in a slow-motion backyard battle, you're going to need a GoPro, an orthopedic surgeon, and a personal injury lawyer. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
From the moment you climbed aboard, I saw semen inside you. More importantly, you've stopped giggling at the word semen. And that's the mark of a real seaman.